Dear students, this is the second video, the continuation of the lesson The Ramapura, written by Kenneth Anderson. So, until here you have understood what it is all about. Dense forest, hilly mountains, thickets, river flowing by, tea planters and tea gardens, and definitely bison, elephant, and our tiger. So here we will proceed further after the tiger, the wounded tiger, who takes away the girl and kills. So what happens next? Let's read and come to know. A month later, a herd boy was killed by a tiger within 2 miles of Ramapuram. In this case, the half-eaten remains were found in a bush. The third human kill occurred about 3 weeks later, almost at the 21st milestone on the Kollegal-Lokanahalli Bangalore Dimbam road. This time it was a road coolie, a middle-aged woman, who was attacked in full view of her companions just before 5 in the evening. She had stopped work for a few minutes and had gone some errands in the jungle when a tiger pounced upon her as if from nowhere and carried her away. She had screamed frenziedly, and those who were in the vicinity had clearly seen the tiger. It had a scarred face and no left eye or ear. It so happened that my game license for the North Coimbatore area had at that time expired. This area is divided into two forest divisions, North Coimbatore proper and the Kollegal division. For although Kollegal fell within North Coimbatore district for administrative purposes, the forest department had recently subdivided the district into two distinct forest divisions. My license, which had expired, covered North Coimbatore proper and Dimbam, while Lokanahalli, Bangalore, and Ramapuram fell within the Kollegal division. I had intended renewing my old license and was about to send the required fee when I read in the newspapers about the latest outrage committed by this tiger. That decided me, and within 10 days privilege leave at my disposal, I left Bangalore early in the morning, reaching the forest department office at Kollegal, 87 miles away. Even before it had opened for the day, it did not take me long to get the required shooting license and all available information regarding the tiger. The area where the man-eater had operated was comparatively new to me, so I decided for a start to camp in the small forest lodge at Ramapuram, 25 miles away, which I reached in an hour and a half. After negotiating an extremely bumpy road, obviously, the first thing to do was to try and win the confidence of the inhabitants of Ramapuram by telling them I had come to try to rid them of the tiger. The people did not know me and gave somewhat garbled accounts, indicating that the tiger might be anywhere between Ponnachai Malai, where it had struck down its first victim, and Bangalore, a distance of about 60 miles as the crow flies. Sorry, I am fumbling. Bangalore, as I have told you, was a small village some 30 miles from Kollegal on the Kollegal Lokanahalli Dimbam road. Thus, I could either return to Kollegal by car and motor, thence to Bangalore, or I could leave the car at Ramapuram and cover the third side of the triangle by walking from Ramapuram to Bangalore, a distance of nearly 19 miles. I decided to follow the latter course as it would give me the opportunity of passing through several forest hamlets bordering the reserved forest, where I hoped to get some news of the tiger. Accordingly, at dawn next morning, I left the little forest lodge at Ramapuram and began my walk to Bangalore. The path led in a generally southwesterly direction, alternatively through sparsely cultivated country and scrub jungle, which skirted the ranges of small hills lying a couple of miles southward within the boundaries of the reserve forest proper. I passed a few hamlets, but all the inhabitants were either indoors or squatting at the entrances of their huts. Their few cattle were kraalled outside or grazed at will on the scant herbage in the immediate vicinity of the huts. For the story of the man eater had spread far and wide, and the usual scare that attends such visitations had already set in. I walked slowly, making inquiries wherever possible. Almost all the Sholagas inhabiting these hamlets reported that they had heard a tiger roaring in the vicinity, either the previous night or within the past 22 hours. At one spot, I was shown the clear pug marks of a tiger as it had crossed a recently plowed field just 100 yards from the owner's hut. I took detailed measurements of those bucks for future reference before moving on, but it soon became evident that the people in this area were either so nervous that they were making completely false and exaggerate reports, or else that an unusual number of tigers were operating along the 19 miles between Ramapuram and Bangalore. For, according to the information obtained, a tiger appeared to have visited each hamlet within the last 3 or 4 days. At about 5 p.m., I approached Bangalore, a village of some 20 huts. Here I met members of the road gang who had witnessed the killing of the women near the 21st milestone. They told me that what I have already recorded and particularly stressed the tiger's deformities, which they had all clearly seen while they stood rooted to the spot with terror. While the tiger made off into the undergrowth with its still screaming victim, the road coolie women, the nearest forest department lodge was some 3.5 miles further along the motor road in the direction of Dimbam. The reserve lay both sides of the road. It was now 5:30 p.m. and I knew that night would fall in an hour, so I covered those last 3.5 miles at a brisk pace, reaching the little forest bungalow shortly before dark. The sun had gone down behind the towering range of the Biligiri Rangana hills, which lay some 3 miles west of the bungalow, and the twilight calls roasting peacock roosting peacock. It's not roasting, right? It's roosting. Peacock and jungle fowl welcomed me. Roosting is sound made by peacocks and the birds. Jungle fowl welcomed me as I sank into an old broken armchair, which I dragged onto the veranda. The distant challenge of a somber stag descending the western range was music to my ears as it floated across the dense valley separating the bungalow from the foothills. The myriad treetops of this valley were like a dark carpet in the deepening twilight. Scarcely half an hour had passed before total darkness prevailed, punctuated by the incensed flicker of a million fireflies. They floated everywhere like tiny elfin spirits in the gloom, carrying their lanterns of pinpoint brilliance to every bush, treetop in the vicinity. At rare intervals, their flashes would synchronize, and the tree or bush around which they clustered would throb and pulsate to one big and unanimous flash of light, made by thousands of these little creatures. The blackness of the jungle night would disperse before a phosphorescent and ethereal glow, but only for a moment until that rare interval of synchronization occurred again. I hope everyone wishes to see the fireflies. If so, dare to venture into the reserve forest for hiking. I made an early night of it, sleeping on the floor of the small central room of the lodge, but at about 2 a.m., the morning call of a tiger woke me. I heard it call at intervals as it traversed the valley until it died away in the distance. Early morning found me back in Bangalore village where I enlisted the help of two local shikaris and purchased three young bullets for bait. One of these were tethered in the bed of the stream that traversed the valley west of the bungalow where I had heard the tiger calling in the night. The second was tied in a small forest glade a bare 100 yards from the roadside, midway between the village and the forest bungalow. To tie the third, we walked back to the 25-mile stone where the road worker had been killed. Close to this spot, the road was crossed by a forest stream known as Odambetta. Its banks were clothed with bamboo except for a small clearing made by the forest department in which seedlings of various forest plants were being experimentally grown. My helpers told me that a tiger often walked through this clearing, and I found this statement to be true, in that bug marks, both old and comparatively new, were visible at three different places. I examined the most recent of these imprints and compared them with the measurements of the bug marks taken at the hamlet on the previous day. Both sets had been made by a male tiger, but those in the departmental plantation belonged to a much older and heavier animal. We tied the third bed on open ground just where the Odambetta stream flows past the plantation. When all this had been done, it was 5:30 p.m., and on our return to Bangalore village, I was approached by a sturdy, good-looking Sholaga who introduced himself as Jacob, the husband of the girl who had been the man-eater's first victim. He said that a party of travelers who had passed by the coffee estate on the slopes of Ponnachai Malai, where he worked, had informed him that a sahib had come to Ramapuram to shoot the tiger. Filled with the idea of revenge for his wife's murder, he had obtained the planter's permission to go to Ramapuram to offer me his assistance. At Ramapuram, he was told that I had gone to Bangalore, whither he had immediately followed me all by himself. Let's see what happens next. I thanked Jacob for his offer and the trouble he had taken to find me and immediately recruited him as my personal helper. I liked his appearance and his calm determination to leave no stone unturned to bring the tiger to book. Jacob smiled army acceptance and thanked me in turn, but he staunchly refused to accept any payment. Indeed, he made it abundantly clear that this was the condition of his offer. I returned to the forest lodge, instructing Jacob and the other two helpers to make an early start next morning and visit the bed near the 21st milestone. For myself, I would visit the other two beds. This I did next morning, first visiting the bull tethered on the stream bed in the valley, then the bed that was tied midway between the forest bungalow and Bangalore village. Both were unharmed, and no traces of pugs were to be seen in any sand that existed near the spots where they were tied. I then walked the remaining distance to Bangalore village, where I awaited the return of my three scouts. Within an hour, they arrived to tell me that the third bait was alive. Leaving Jacob and one of the Sholagas at the village, I took the second man who claimed to be well acquainted with the forest game paths in that area and walked westward till we entered the foothills of the Biligiri Rangans. As all this area was unfamiliar to me, I got him to walk in front, while I covered him from the rear with my rifle ready in my hands. Sholagas are born jungle folk, and my guide showed no signs of nervousness while we threaded our ways thus in single file up one game path and down another. Across dark nullahs, often bending double to avoid overhanging fronds of bamboo or outcrops of wait a bit thorn. But no signs of a fresh tiger track did we see. A large male panther had crossed at one spot, and at another spot a female accompanied by her cub. But it was evident that the tiger we were looking for had not passed that way. It was nearing 3 p.m. before we got back to the forest lodge and a late cold lunch. The Sholaga made a fire on which I boiled some water to brew us several cups of tea. Then I drew water from the little well in the compound to give myself the luxury of a cold bath. At 5, I returned with the Sholaga to Bangalore village where I left him with instructions for Jacob himself and the third Sholaga to visit the bait on the 21st milestone early next morning. It was well past 7 by the time I got back to the bungalow. I slept soundly that night, nor did the morning call of any tiger disturb me. Early morning found me on my way to visit the other two baits, but both were unharmed. Returning to the forest lodge, I ate a frugal meal and then walked towards Bangalore, carefully watching the road of pug marks. No tiger had passed that way, and 9:15 a.m. found me awaiting by henchmen. They returned before 10, this time to report that the bait had been killed and removed by a tiger, which had contrived to bite through the tethering rope. Fortunately, I had come prepared for such an eventuality and had brought my torch and other night suit shooting kit with me in a haversack. Back we went as fast as we could, and shortly after midday had reached the spot where the bull had been tied. The tiger's pug marks in approaching the bait were apparent in the soft earth some 20 feet away, and an examination showed that the killer was a tigress and not a tiger. From there, she had launched her final attack that had killed the bull, biting through the rope by which its leg had been tied. We could not know how far the kill had been taken, so I told my companions to wait for me by the 21st milestone till 3 p.m. While I would follow the drag mark, if the dead bull had been taken for some distance, I would try to build myself a hideout to await the return of the tigress and would make it an all night affair. Under such circumstances, I would not be back. I would not be back by 3, and they were to return to Bangalore. On the other hand, if the tigress had dropped the kill not far away, I would return to my companions and get them to put up a proper marchand. I found the tigress had half dragged the kill for the first 200 yards, by which time she had got clear of the bamboo jungle that grew on the lower land and in the vicinity of the stream. Then she had encountered some heavy lantana undergrowth, which had obviously been an obstruction to her passage. Encumbered as she was with the dead bull, here she had evidently slung it over her shoulder, as tigers sometimes do to carry their kills, and it then became extremely difficult to follow the trail. The dragging hoop or the horns of the bull had here and there broken a twig, and these were the only visible signs of passage. The carpet of rotting vegetation and fallen lantana leaves effectively did away with any hope of finding pug marks. Necessarily, the going was also very slow, nor did I like the situation at all, as almost my whole attention had to be given to following the trail, which prevented me from being fully on my guard against a sudden attack. Finally, the lantana gave way to more open forest, sprinkled liberally with trees and a carpet of the dwarf date palm. Twice I came across the spot where the tigress had laid down her burden and then picked it up again. It was now evident that she had some particular destination in view, most probably a lair where she had cubs to whom she was taking the meat. Up and up led the trail. The terrain became more and more rocky till finally, in a break among the tree trunks, I saw a hillock. Perhaps a quarter of a mile beyond and about 200 feet above the spot where I stood. The trail led directly toward the hillock. By now, I felt reasonably certain that the animal I was following was not the man eater, because all the data gathered about the man eater had classed it as a tiger and not a tigress. Although the sex factor was not an established certainty, as it was a known fact, however, that the man eater had lost its left eye and ear. If I could but catch a glimpse of the animal I was following, I could soon know whether it was the right one or not. How to catch that glimpse was the problem. The obvious answer to it was to keep advancing till we met, but it was scarcely to my liking. As even if the tigress was not the man eater, she certainly was unlikely to welcome any human being who knocked at the door of the lair where she had her cubs. But I went forward. The trail was now easier to follow as the tigress had brushed against boulders and rocks, which where smears of blood betrayed the passage of the dead bull. Curious, huh? Let's know more about it. Half the distance was covered now, the other half would bring me to the summit. The boulders lay in heaps, and the trail I was following wound in and out between them. As the tigress picked her path to avoid any part of her burden becoming jammed between the rocks, it was 10 minutes to 3. The sun beat down mercilessly on the bare rocks, which in turn threw the heat back in my face as from the door of a furnace. My clothes were soaked with perspiration, which ran in rivers down my face, getting into my eyes, which burned and smarted, and into the corners of my mouth. I licked my lips and remembered that almost unconsciously, in the excitement of the movement, I noted the salty taste. Wow. He's trying to show us the picture through his words. Just try to imagine. You will really enjoy it. How silly. My rubber boots made no sound as I negotiated the heated rocks. One corner after another was turned, and at each turn I knew what lay beyond. Then I came upon a shelving rock which met the rising ground at an angle of perhaps 300, forming a shallow recess rather than a real cave. Two large balls of russet brown streaked with black white underneath were tumbling over one another in a vigorous game of catch as catch can. They were two tiger cubs and they were playing. I stopped in my tracks, the only movement being an imperceptible cocking of the rifle with the faintest of clicks, but it was enough. Although they were only cubs, generations of instinct were behind them. They stopped playing, disentangled themselves, and looked at me in alarm. Even now I can picture the scene, one cub with a look of innocent surprise and the other with its features wrinkled to emit a hiss of consternation. That hiss was a signal for all hell to break loose, for it awoke the tigress who was sleeping. With a series of shattering roars, she dashed out of the cavern, vaulted over the cubs, and came straight at me. The distance may have been 20 yards. I covered her between eyes as she advanced. Then, 5 yards away, she stopped. She crouched with her belly to ground, eyes blazing and mouth wide, while her roars and snarls shook the very ground on which I stood. She was a perfect specimen, but certainly not the man eater. Enjoying, huh? Story is really interesting. Wonder of wonders, she had not charged home. Her courage had failed her at the last movement. She was telling me in the simplest of languages, get out quickly and don't harm my cubs or I'll kill you. Tiger is speaking to him. I was glad to oblige. Step by step, I retreated backwards while never removing my eyes from hers, never allowing the rifle sights to waver in the slightest. My forefinger still on the trigger, and she remained where she was. It was as if she understood that I was going. I realized at that moment that she did not want to harm me, that she was only protecting her cubs. Perhaps she was afraid. I was afraid too. But I did not want to harm her, nor destroy that lovely, happy little family. So sweet. So I continued to retreat backwards. The tigress continued to roar. Now I had turned the corner of the first rock that hid her from view. Only then did I dare to take a hasty glance backwards to see where I was walking, although I still faced towards the tigress, who had now stopped roaring but was still growling. I knew that as long as she continued to make those sounds, I was safe. I would know where she was. Another big boulder was passed. Then I turned and beat a hasty retreat before she had time to change her mind and come after me. She stopped growling, and I knew that the real danger had come. She might have gone back to her cubs, or she might be following. I made down the hill as rapidly as possible, glancing frequently behind me. Soon I came to the trees and the date palms, then the lantana belt up which I had so laboriously followed the trail, and finally to the bamboos and the road. Poor chap. It was 4:30 p.m. and as instructed, my companions had returned to Bangalore. I had 9 miles to cover and only 2 hours before darkness fell. Nevertheless, I sat by the roadside for 5 minutes, to enjoy a quick smoke. I felt I deserved it. I was thankful too that I had not been forced to shoot the tigress, for the sight of those two cubs was still fresh in my memory. It was six it was past 6:30 before I reached Bailore village. There my three companions awaited me, eager to hear my story. When I had told it, they agreed that it was unusual for a tigress to have failed to press home her charge. Darkness had set in by the time I left the little village on the last lap of my journey to the forest bungalow. But as one of our baits was tied at a point about halfway between the village and the bungalow in a glade not far from the road, it occurred to me that I would pay it a visit. Why this idea came to me, I cannot tell particularly, as I had already looked at it that morning on my way to Baylor. It was an impulse, a tide. I have spent my life responding to impulses. I turned off along the little footpath that led away from the road towards a clearing where the bait was tied. It was quite dark except for the diffused glow from the stars that shone brightly in a clear blue black sky. The bushes around me assumed ghostly shapes, and the wind sighed fitfully among the branches of the rain tree that bordered the road. Now and again a large teak leaf fluttered to the ground with the softest of sounds, like some huge moth of the night settling down to rest. I came up to the small wild fig tree beneath which my bait was tied. The shadows were deeper there, and the bait was moreover a brown one. I could not see it till I came very close, when it lumbered to its feet as if startled at my approach. Even as I was startled by its sudden action, it was still unharmed. I walked around it to the other side to inspect the rope that held it by the hind leg, in case it had become twisted. Very interesting, right? And at that moment, the Manitou charged. It was fortunate for me that I had moved to the other side of the bull, which consequently came between me and the tiger. But I confess that I was taken totally by surprise. There was tremendous oof from the jungle from which I had just emerged. The bull swung round. I leaped behind it, with my back to the trunk of the fig tree, almost tripping over the tethering rope. A huge grey shape vaulted onto the back of the bull, which collapsed beneath the sudden weight. But the tiger had not seized the neck or throat. It had simply leaped upon the bull in order to reach me beyond it. Luckily, in falling, the bull ruined the tiger's spring, which otherwise would have followed within a split second. The tiger was extricating itself from the heaving body of the fallen bull when my bullet smashed between its eyes. Convulsively, it twisted backwards, still lying across the bull, which now staggered to its feet with the tiger over its back, the head and four quarters sagging forwards. Automatically and without thinking, I fired my second shot at a spot which I judged to be behind the tiger's left shoulder. The bull collapsed. The tiger rolled off the bull and towards me as my third shot took it in the throat. The bull never moved. The tiger kicked convulsively, and then at last all was still. The light from the torch on the rifle revealed that my first bullet had smashed the tiger's skull. My second had been too low. The heavy 405 missile had plowed through the end of the tiger's chest and blown a tremendous hole in the bull's side. My third bullet, a quite unnecessary one, had passed through the tiger's throat, leaving a gaping hole. But I had killed the poor bull that had unwittingly saved my life. Finally, my hands were trembling, my knees wobbled, and suddenly I felt very, very sick. The reaction after the events of that evening was sudden. I sat on the ground with my back to the fig tree and raised my hand to my forehead, which I was surprised to find icy cold to my touch. How long I remained thus I don't know. Then I groped for my pipe, filled and lit it. The first few puffs steadied my badly shaken nerves, and I was soon able to get back to the road and retrace my steps to Bangalore village. I found the inhabitants gathered in the streets, agog with excitement and anticipation, for the surrounding hills had carried the sound of my three shots, which had reverberated across the valleys and stony ridges. They had guessed I had been attacked on the way to the bungalow, but were wondering whether it had been by the man eater or some bear or elephant. Seeing me emerge from the gloom, they rushed forward to welcome me. My three servants swelled to the fore. I sat down by the roadside and told them the story. Gasps of amazement and incredulity broke from their lips, to be followed by congratulations and a fervent expression of thanks for my safety. A chatty of fresh hot milk was set before me, and a bunch of bananas. As gifts go, it was not much, but it conveyed the heartfelt thanks of the villagers. In another half hour, practically the whole village had assembled with lanterns and kerosene torches, a stout pole, and coils of rope to bring in the tiger. Back we went to the spot, and over 50 people surveyed the strange scene, their eyes wide open with amazement. Jacob was specially pathetic to watch. With his knife, he started to stab the dead tiger, to my dismay, for he was doing further damage to the skin already well nigh ruined my bullets. Gently but firmly, I drew him off. Then he began to weep unrestrainedly, thinking of his dead wife. The deep hearted weeping of a strong and brave man is not pleasant to witness, it is infectious, and I felt a strange jump rising in my own throat, a lump which refused to subside for quite a time. Not much remains to be told except for a strange sequel. Next morning, when coming to the bungalow, Jacob passed the spot where I had left the road the previous night. 50 yards further on, he decided to answer a call of nature and stepped behind a star plum bush for the purpose. There he discovered for the first time that the tiger had been lying in wait for me the previous night. Evidently, it had been in the vicinity and had either seen or heard me approaching along the road. Jacob told me what he had discovered, and I walked back with him to check it for myself. I found what he said was true. There, clearly impressed on the soft sand, were tiger's pug marks, while the soft grass and rank weeds beneath the star plum bush were still partly flattened by the weight of the tiger's body, although more than 12 hours had passed since he had lain there in ambush, awaiting my approach. Yet, some people tell me that there is no such thing as providence, a guiding spirit, intuition, or a sixth sense. Call it what you will. I find it more difficult to understand the disbelievers than understand providence itself. In this section, I would not like to give you any kind of summary or pointers because it's a very, very simple and lucid language to understand. The imagination power of yours to fill those words into a movie is amazing. Just for your reference, I am giving here some of the words to understand. Hold sway, exert influence or hold power. Escarpment, a long cliff or deep slope. Gradient strewn with boulders, upward or downward slope covered with rocks. Impenetrable, out of reach, not accessible. Altitude, high level, height from the sea level. Formidable, daunting, threatening, impenetrable. Moaning, crying of pain or cry of pain. Swooned, faint. Ethereal, not worldly, it's heavenly. Frugal meal, simple or poor meal. Encumbered, weighed down by responsibility or heavy load. So the chapter which you all have is being taken from the source Anderson, Kenneth, Man-Eaters and Jungle Killers, New Delhi, Rupa and Co.